and welcome to Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear AI researchers chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we'll provide summaries and discussion of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter, linked to at lastweekinai.com, for articles we did not cover in this episode. And before we start, if you have any feedback or thoughts about our podcast, feel free to email us at contact@lastweekinai.com. We would love to hear from you. And I'm one of your co-hosts, Dr. Sharon Zhou.
And I'm your other co-host, Andrei Kurenkov. And in this episode, we'll be talking about procedural storytelling for games, how Twitch is using machine learning to detect suspicious users, some research from DeepMind on helping mathematicians, and some research on combating biases, the new project by Timnit Gebru, killer robots, and finally a fun art project. So to start, let's go ahead and look into our applications and business news stories, starting with procedural storytelling is exploding the possibilities of video game narratives from The Verge. Basically, this article is kind of an overview of the concept of procedural storytelling in games, where, instead of having a pre-written script, there is algorithm, let's say, to generate improvised stories that kind of have a similar structure, but the stuff that happens changes every time. And this article goes over that and some recent examples of games that use it. And these games, it's not obvious. Maybe it can be seen as a simple form of AI. It's something that is researched a lot in AI. But we've also seen things like AI Dungeon recently that use sophisticated AI to do procedural storytelling. So it's a neat topic to be aware of, for sure.
I think this is super cool. So procedural storytelling, for those who don't know, is when you're playing a game, a lot of, oftentimes a game is like fully already, the order of events is already there. The form of the events has already been designed. But for a procedural generation, that's not the case. Like, you might get something vastly different from me when I'm playing it. And it all depends. It unfolds as you play it. And I think what's exciting about this is that we can kind of see, like, okay, these like actual indie games are taking this on and doing pretty good at that. And on the other end is something like AI Dungeon, which is using complete AI. And I feel like there's probably a meeting in the middle, or, more AI that will be used for something like this as we reduce, constraints on what can be procedurally generated.
Yeah. I also quite enjoy the concept and think it's interesting. Kind of core to games in general is sort of emergent gameplay where, even if it's not a narrative per se, stuff happens that, you can tell other people about that's, interesting or fun. You play GTA and sometimes some crazy stuff comes together and it's pretty funny. But it's interesting in this article, they highlight how there have been just in the past year in 2020, two of these games, Wildermyth and Unexplored 2, that are a very strong example of games that rely on these procedural storytelling concepts. So yeah, I was not aware of these games. I'm excited to see them, maybe even play them, and I'm excited to see possibly ideas from AI, be used to maybe drive the genre forward and make it more common.
Absolutely. And our next article is Twitch introduces machine learning feature to detect suspicious users. So Twitch has been having a difficult time as, more people are using Twitch. But also this rough year has also has come with a lot of hate raids, a lot of streamer abuse, unfortunately, a lot of bad behavior on the platform, and moderating it has been pretty challenging. And the company has now come out with a new way of dealing with this, and it is to flag suspicious users who might be malicious or something like that within the platform. And I think this kind of moderation and this kind of, like hate raids have occurred across a lot of these different platforms. Zoom, for example, Zoom bombing is a whole thing. So it's not surprising that this has been a problem, but it's great to see how they have come out with some kind of solution where they essentially flag certain users.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a great use of AI. They call this new system the suspicious user detection system. And basically on a live basis, as you have a chat, which is what Twitch has, you have a running sort of discussion instead of just posts. The moderator or the streamer can see this model classify certain comments as maybe being likely to be bad, and then that comment is actually hidden, that then needs to be kind of approved by the streamer or the mod. And there's also a possible marking where there's kind of less hidden, and this will be turned on by default for all streamers. So it's interesting, they are really confident at this. And of course, AI-driven moderation is common. It's used in Facebook and really probably every site. But this sort of live chat thing maybe is pretty novel, and I think very useful for sure.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, they're rolling it out to everyone because they want to make sure that they make a safe space, the Twitch a safe space. But on the other hand, they're very transparent in that they warn that there might be growing pains for the machine learning algorithm to be accurate, and that there might be some false positives and negatives, which is great. I think that they released that statement.
Definitely. Yeah. And this article notes that especially this feature could help streamers who are women or people of color who presumably have probably worse things turn up in their chat. So yeah, I think it's a great development and really cool. Moving on to discussing some research, we have some exciting new stuff from DeepMind. And this article is DeepMind's AI helps untangle the mathematics of knots. So this is about the recent paper, Advancing Mathematics by Guiding Human Intuition with AI, that was released in Nature. And basically, it presents two use cases where kind of similar techniques were used to detect some possible patterns in different studies of math. So there was one in the theory of knots and the other in the study of symmetries. And this machine learning model basically looked at a lot of different knots, a lot of different symmetries, something like that. I don't really understand, but it looked at a lot of kind of options, found some things that correlate or seem related, and then presented some sort of theorem or conjecture that then a human mathematician could use to discover something novel. And apparently it has led to some discoveries. So it's, pretty exciting.
I think this is super exciting. This is where, these models are going to start helping with science and moving these fields forward, not just by being better at predicting, but actually by supporting humans and experts in particular. So I think this is super exciting stuff. And yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes and whether we'll make some serious breakthroughs in math moving forward.
For sure. And I think it's also interesting kind of as a trend. So this paper came about through a collaboration between, DeepMind, but also some people at Oxford who are not theorists. So it was a collaboration from the start between mathematicians and these AI developers, which we've seen DeepMind do before. Recently, we talked about weather forecasting, where we collaborated with an organization focused on that. And of course, AlphaFold presumably had that. So cool to see this sort of trend where they are doing applied research across disciplines and are getting really cool results.
And I think math is a pretty, like, just like programming, pretty nice in that you can verify certain things, and you could say like, hey, this proof actually does is valid, and you can go through that with math, and with code you was like, this program can actually run. I think with other things it'll be a little more challenging, but it's still very exciting to see AI seep into things like this.
Yeah, this is also exciting because it's a new way, at least in math, for humans to collaborate with AI, where the AI just presents some conjectures that may or may not be true based on looking at a whole bunch of patterns. And then mathematicians can take some conjecture and then attempt to write a proof to then, make sure it's true. So yeah, it's good to see like AI is not taking over math research. And I think as with most things, it's more about how humans can work alongside AI.
Exactly. And on to our next article. Yale researchers combat biases in machine learning algorithms. So this article is based on the paper Eliminating Latent Discrimination, Train Then Mask. And so this is one study, an attempt to make machine learning more, quote unquote, objective while still training on inherently biased training data. And so the method is basically masking out sensitive features so that there are indistinguishable values for every individual on those features. So what that means is they'll first train actually the model on all data, and then the masking happens afterwards, and they mask out features like age or race, so that each data sample actually could have the same, age or race, and have to do that prediction task there. While this reduces accuracy, it does improve with fairness. And the researchers said this also works for especially simple models in a provable way. And yeah, I think this is, great work. I have actually feel like I've seen things that are quite similar to this, and that do also have this trend of reducing accuracy, unfortunately still, but yeah. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, as you said, it's neat to see an algorithm for this, especially one that's so intuitive. Of course, this is a whole area of study, and I'm someone not in that area. I don't know much about what's going on, so it was neat to see this article. This is from Yale Daily News. And actually, this paper came out a few years ago, so I'm not sure why they wrote it up just now. But I think, as you said, since then, presumably similar techniques and new techniques have been developed. I think it's also kind of good for people outside of AI research to kind of be made aware of these sorts of efforts, because I think it's becoming more and more kind of understood that AI leads to prejudice and bias and sort of problematic things. And, we're working on it. The community is working on it. We haven't quite cracked it, but we're trying to. And moving on to discussing some other things relating to ethics and society more broadly. First of all, we have the news story: ex-Googler Timnit Gebru starts her own AI research center, and this one is written up by Wired. So as the title implies, this is all about a new initiative, a new research center by Timnit Gebru, who I guess infamously was fired from Google a year ago, actually almost exactly a year ago, over a paper she co-wrote having to do with some of the ethical implications of things related to Google's research. And this was a big story. We covered it, I think, more than a couple times, and generally it was kind of a big deal. So now it has been announced that her current initiative is this Distributed AI Research Institute, or DARE, which is basically designed to be independent of big tech, funded by sort of nonprofits and foundations, and also, as the name says, distributed in the sense of kind of not necessarily just in one area like Silicon Valley, but instead incorporating research and researchers from different backgrounds and throughout the world, with the hope to basically have their background to know sort of which areas to focus on and where AI can be helpful. So yeah, this is definitely exciting to hear about. What did you think about it, Sharon?
Finally! I was really excited for her to do this like right after she got fired, but I think it's even better that it's like the anniversary, because I know a lot went on in between as well. And I'm very excited, to see her spearhead this organization and actually make change that like she's been working on or tried to work on at some of these companies, right? So I'm very excited to see where this goes.
Yeah, and just to comment a bit more on her background, in case you're not aware, her research focuses on AI ethics and sort of problems that arise out of misuses of AI and how it is applied. So in some ways, it's pretty opposed to big tech like Google and Facebook, which are really pushing on AI and sometimes deploying it before it's really safe. There's been, I think, rumblings about this sort of thing happening, I think, for a few months, and Timnit has been kind of giving talks and so on this year, but now the details are out and there's a whole press release, and actually the first published research from this institute is now being presented at NeurIPS, a paper called Constructing a Visual Dataset to Study the Effects of Spatial Apartheid in South Africa. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. It's pretty different from what exists as an institute, sort of independent of both academia and industry. And it makes a lot of sense for this field of AI ethics to sort of try to steer these big companies in a better direction. So exciting to see what happens next with this.
Absolutely. And on to our next article. U.S. rejects calls for regulating or banning, quote, killer robots. Okay, so the U.S., this very spicy clickbaity title, the U.S. Has in fact rejected those calls and instead proposed a code of conduct at the United Nations. I think it's, it was at this a meeting in Geneva that was for the UN to focus on finding common ground on the use of these lethal autonomous weapons. And one U.S. official actually thought it was ridiculous to regulate their use through a legally binding agreement. And so I guess we're getting killer robots. I think this is going to be, like nuclear weapons potentially, where there will be, it'll be frozen. If everyone has it, then no one can use it kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's basically where we're going to have them. And the military is obviously working on it very actively. So
yeah. So this is not necessarily surprising. This term "killer robots" actually is sort of the kind of euphemism or a different way to phrase a more technical term, which is lethal autonomous weapons. And yeah, basically, the US is saying we don't want laws, we want a non-binding code of conduct, which is not too surprising, although they're not the only ones. Also, India and a number of countries criticized this idea of a legally binding agreement. And unsurprisingly, there's campaigners about regulation of these sorts of things. So there's actually an organization called the Campaign to Stop Kill Robots that's been pretty active in the past decade and pushing for this. And I think it's sensible to be a bit pessimistic about this trend not happening. It seems pretty inevitable, sadly.
Yeah. Well, on to our last article that is much more fun, is who exactly authored this AI-generated spin on Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo? Okay, so basically there's this movie called Vertigo, and someone had an AI watch that movie, essentially going through all the frames, and then based on what it's learned, what it's represented from that movie, generate additional parts of that movie, or generate another film called Vertigo AI, which is based on, learning or representing the Vertigo data set. And they said that, the generated things were the generated content dialogue was going off on wild tangents. That's obviously not super surprising given what we know about GPT models. And they used things verbatim. So that was pretty fun as well. And so imagery and narration, all machine generated.
Yeah, exactly. If you watch it, it's basically a bunch of frames from, let's say, like if you have a bad GAN, where it's just like splotches of colors and like very roughly the shape of a human, but it's like impressionist art. It's essentially 5 minutes of that with like shifting between different things and with a separate narration from, I guess, a language model. And yeah, this was by Los Angeles-based artist Chris Peters. So I'm not sure why, this title is like who. I guess it's implying that the AI offered it or something. So I guess it's a fun experiment. Honestly, there's a lot of artists utilizing AI these days that have been doing it for a while. So this is not a very, let's say, interesting use of AI, I don't think. I wouldn't say it's anything like really intriguing art aside from the novelty. But it's pretty fun. And it's a fun thing to take a look at if you want some sort of bizarre example of the weird things that you can get from AI, and how you can spin that into a 5-minute little film. Actually, this reminds me of something I've seen a while back, which is there are these videos that people make where it is AI generated imagery that is made to create a music video. So basically the output, it's the sequential film where, depending on the beat or sort of the music, we get this interpolation of kind of the seed of the model. So it switches to these different visualizations. And that's actually really fun to see. It's really interesting to see kind of sync to the music, the image jump from one abstract thing to another. With AI, especially when it's so abstract, it's just kind of very neat. And when it's synced to the music, it's kind of makes a new and I think more interesting result in this thing.
Yeah, I can see that. That makes all TikTok videos seem more interesting too.
Do you have any examples of AI art that you found fun? I think you were just looking at AI weirdness, right?
Yes. There's so much weird stuff out there. I've generated things from Mini Dolly that's been pretty fun of myself, and that's been interesting. I also found it interesting. I think there were only 20 epochs on this model. So that was interesting. I mean, many different frames. But I wonder if we could actually do a lot better. But I think they wanted to probably limit compute.
The precise thing they did is kind of not stated, so it's unclear. Presumably they just trained again and underfit, and so it produces these very abstract images that don't quite match to anything. But yeah, as you said, I think people playing around with VQ, GAN, and CLIP and GPT-3 produce a lot of fun stuff that is not quite this high concept or, I don't know, artistic, but really fun.
Right. And with that, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Skynet Day's Last Week in AI podcast. But before we go, please let us know any thoughts you have directly to our email, contact@lastweekinai.com. And you can find the articles we discussed here today and subscribe to our weekly newsletter with similar ones at lastweekinai.com.
And subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And do please give us a rating and a review in iTunes or wherever you do, maybe Spotify. It would help the show grow, I think. Anyway, everyone says to do this, so we also would like you to do it if you can. And be sure to tune in next week